London, 1827. The city was alive with noise, shadows, and secrets. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestones, their lanterns swinging dim light into narrow alleys. Thick fog rolled in from the Thames, swallowing sound and sight alike. And somewhere, behind the rows of gas lamps and the chatter of late-night taverns, a killer waited in the dark. This is the story of Eliza Grimwood, a young actress whose brutal murder shocked Victorian England, a crime so bloody, so personal, that whispers of it never fully died. Her killer was never found, but what lingered in the streets long after her death was something even more terrifying. They say Eliza Grimwood never left, that her screams, her shadow, her ghost, still haunt the place where her life was taken. The city and the time. The year was 1827. London was not yet the great industrial metropolis it would become, but already it was bursting at the seams. The population swelled past 1.5 million, with rich aristocrats walking arm in arm past beggars who starved in the gutters. The city was a contradiction. By day, sunlight fell on markets, theatres, and shops filled with chatter and music. By night, it turned into a world of shadows. The alleys of Southwark and Whitechapel swarmed with thieves and prostitutes, their faces half hidden beneath candlelight. Murder was not rare, but the murder of a young woman in her own home, mutilated beyond recognition, sent tremors through London society. Eliza Grimwood was no stranger to the darker corners of the city. She lived in a small but respectable home at 8 Wellington Street, near Covent Garden. She worked on the stage, an actress of some rising reputation. But behind the glamour of theatre, Eliza had another life. One whispered about, but never written openly in polite society. She entertained gentlemen. Some said she had lovers among the wealthiest men of London. Some said she knew secrets that could ruin them, and some believed it was one of those men fearing exposure who crept into her bedroom one fateful night. Eliza Grimwood was just 19 years old. Descriptions of her from the time paint her as striking dark hair, pale skin, and a quiet, watchful presence. On stage she was animated, graceful, and daring. Off stage she was known as reserved, even secretive. Her neighbours described her as polite, but distant. She came and went at odd hours, slipping into carriages late at night. Rumours circled about her visitors, wealthy men in fine coats who preferred not to be seen. But what is most chilling is how ordinary her last day appeared. On the evening of May 26, 1827, Eliza was seen chatting with acquaintances. She laughed. She smiled. She even made plans to attend a gathering later that week. She returned home just before midnight, accompanied by a man. The details of that man are still debated. Some claimed he was tall, with a military bearing. Others whispered he was an aristocrat who disguised himself to avoid recognition. But what everyone agrees on is this: he was the last person seen alive with Eliza Grimwood. The night of the murder, imagine the scene, the house at 8 Wellington Street stood in the dim glow of the gas lamps. Neighbours slept behind locked shutters. The silence of the night pressed against the walls. Somewhere in the upstairs bedroom, Eliza prepared for bed. Sometime in the dark hours of early morning, the quiet was shattered. No screams were reported. No one heard footsteps or breaking glass. The city lay asleep, unaware that something horrific was happening behind those thin brick walls. It was not until the following morning, May 27th, that the horror revealed itself. The Discovery A servant, entering the house as dawn lit the street. went upstairs to check on Eliza. What she found would scar her for the rest of her life. Eliza Grimwood lay sprawled across her bed, her white nightdress drenched in blood. Her throat had been slashed so deeply it nearly severed her head. Her body was mutilated, the wounds violent, frenzied, and merciless. Blood soaked into the mattress, staining the floorboards below. The room told a strange story. Nothing was stolen. No valuables missing. No sign of forced entry. On a chair nearby lay a gentleman's coat, fine and expensive, spattered with blood. Whoever had killed her had done so in intimate proximity, in a place where she felt safe. The servants' screams carried into the street, drawing neighbors, constables, and eventually a crowd. Soon, word of the murder spread like fire. Panic and speculation. The London press seized on the story. Newspapers called it the Wellington Street Horror. People whispered that the murder was the work of a lover and aristocrat, perhaps, or a jealous suitor. Some pointed to her past relationships. Eliza had once been linked to a naval officer who left her abruptly. Others spoke of wealthy men who visited her discreetly. Men who would lose everything if their names were connected to hers. But there were stranger theories too. Some believed she was the victim of a copycat killer, echoing the gruesome Ratcliffe Highway murders that had shocked London years earlier. Others thought her death was ritualistic part of a curse tied to the theatre world itself. And then there were those who swore they saw her ghost. The haunting begins there. Murder left a scar not only on Wellington Street, but on the imaginations of those who lived nearby. Within days of her burial, rumours spread that Eliza had not found peace. Passers-by claimed to see a figure at her bedroom window, even after the room had been emptied. Some swore they heard the sound of faint sobbing drifting into the street. And others, those bold enough to walk near the house at night, reported hearing screams. Piercing, anguished screams. The accounts grew darker. Carriage drivers refused to pass Wellington Street after midnight, claiming they saw a pale figure step into the road, only to vanish when they pulled their horses to a halt. Tenants who later occupied the building never stayed long. They spoke of waking to icy drafts, of footsteps pacing the halls, and of a woman's voice whispering just beyond the door. It was said that every year, on the anniversary of her death, Eliza Grimwood's ghost returned, always in white, always with her throat glistening red. She would walk the street as if searching for the man who ended her life, the unsolved nature of the crime. But even as her ghost became legend, the real horror remained unsolved. The coat left behind in her bedroom should have been the perfect clue, yet no man came forward to claim it. Some suggested it belonged to a high-ranking nobleman whose family influence erased his name from the record. Others whispered of a cover-up, that police deliberately ignored powerful suspects to avoid scandal. Theories abounded, but evidence was scarce. Witnesses contradicted one another. Alibis seemed to shift. And so, despite the frenzy of the investigation, no one was ever charged to this day. The name of Eliza Grimwood's killer remains a mystery. Why her story endears nearly 2 centuries have passed since that night. London has grown and changed. The gas lamps are gone, the carriages replaced by buses and cars. But Wellington Street still stands, its cobblestones whispering memories of the past. Locals still tell her story. Tour guides point to the spot where her house once stood, lowering their voices as they describe her grisly end. And visitors often claim that even in the bustle of modern London, if you walk that street at the right hour, you can feel the sudden drop in temperature, the sense of being watched, the faint echo of something that should not be there. Eliza Grimwood's death was more than just another Victorian murder. It was a mirror reflecting the darker truths of her time, the vulnerability of women, the corruption of power, and the way secrets can fester in silence until they bleed into violence. And perhaps that is why her ghost lingers, not merely as a spirit seeking revenge, but as a reminder of a crime never solved, a life brutally taken, a voice forever silenced in the shadows of London. Soft, eerie pause. Music fades into low strings, but this is only the beginning, because to understand the horror of Eliza Grimwood's death, we must step deeper into the London of 1827, into the alleys, the theatres, and the secret rooms where wealth and desire collided in dangerous ways. And in doing so, we begin to ask the same question that haunted Londoners nearly 200 years ago: who killed Eliza Grimwood? And why does her spirit still walk the streets of Wellington? The night of May 26th, 1827. Eliza Grimwood was alive, laughing, moving through her familiar circles of Covent Garden, the theatre district humming with music and chatter. Nobody knew that by morning her name would be on every Londoner's lips, whispered in taverns, printed in scander sheets, and mourned in hushed tones by the neighbours who had lived alongside her. As midnight passed, a man walked her home. The streets glistened with mist, lamplight glowing like pale eyes through the fog. A witnesser cab driver claimed he saw her enter the door with a tall figure, one wearing a fine coat. That was the last moment Eliza Grimwood was ever seen alive. Inside the room, what happened inside her bedroom in those hours before dawn has never been truly explained. But the evidence, however grim, allows us to imagine the horror. Her body was found sprawled across the mattress, her nightdress clinging to her skin, stained with blood. The cut to her throat was savage, nearly decapitating her. But it did not end there. Her chest bore wounds that seemed almost frenzied, stabbed again and again with violent intent. Her face, once known for its beauty on the stage, was mutilated, whether to disguise her identity or to destroy her in death. No one could say that the position of her body suggested she had been taken by surprise. Perhaps she awoke in terror, struggling in the dark, the silence of the city pressing in as she fought for her life. No neighbours reported hearing a struggle. No one heard her scream. Whoever the killer was, he silenced her quickly, and left behind only blood. The horrific discovery morning came. The servant girl, tasked with attending to the house, unlocked the door at first light. What she saw on the bed upstairs nearly drove her mad. Her screams tore through the street, shattering the quiet dawn. Neighbours rushed out, some entering the home despite the girl's pleas to stay away. And what they found seared itself into their memories forever. Eliza Grimwood, 19 years old, lay lifeless, her throat cut so deep that her head rested unnaturally, nearly severed, her chest and arms slashed beyond recognition, the sheets drenched crimson, soaked through into the mattress. In the corner of the room sat an object that would confound investigators for years to come. A gentleman's coat, fine in quality, spattered with blood. The crowd gathers within an hour. Wellington Street was clogged with onlookers. Word of the crime spread like wildfire. Crowds pressed against the doorway, desperate to glimpse the horror within. Some claimed the floorboards still dripped blood into the rooms below. Others whispered that the smell of iron and decay clung to the very air. The coroner and constables forced their way through, pushing back the mob, but the rumours had already begun. Some said her lover had killed her in a fit of jealousy. Others insisted it was the work of a powerful man, someone who left behind his coat but knew the police would never dare accuse him. And there was one more theory, whispered quietly with unease, that the crime was not human at all, that something darker, something unearthly, had entered that room in the dead of night. Witness a neighbor swore she saw a shadow moving in the window around 3 in the morning, though she could not tell if it was Eliza or her companion. Another claimed he heard footsteps in the street, hurried but heavy, followed by silence. A cab driver reported picking up a man, disheveled and pale, not far from Wellington Street just before dawn. His coat was missing, and his hands were trembling as though he had been running. When asked where he wanted to go, the man reportedly said only anywhere. Anywhere but here. The cab driver, unnerved, later swore that the man vanished into an alleyway before paying his fare. The strange details. The investigation revealed several strange details that only deepened the mystery. First, there was no sign of forced entry. Whoever entered the house that night had either been invited in or already had a key. Second, despite the brutality of the attack, nothing was stolen. Eliza's jewelry, her small savings, even valuables lying in plain sight were untouched. This was not a robbery. It was something more intimate, more personal. Third, the gentleman's coat. It was a fine garment, made of expensive cloth, clearly tailored for a wealthy man. Yet no one ever came forward to claim it. And when the police attempted to trace its maker, the tailor gave conflicting answers, as though under pressure to forget where it had come from. Finally, the lack of noise. Neighbors reported no screams, no cries, no struggle. It was as if the house itself swallowed the sound, leaving only silence to mask the horror unfolding within. Rumors and theories as the days passed, the story grew wilder. Some whispered that Eliza had been the mistress of a powerful nobleman, and that her death was meant to keep her silent forever. Others believed she was murdered by a jealous rival, a woman who envied her beauty and charm. But the strangest rumors came from those who spoke of curses. They said Eliza had been warned not to take up residence on Wellington Street, that the ground itself was tainted. Some even claimed her death was part of a ritual, her blood spilled not by one man, but by something calling itself through human hands. Whether people believed the rumors or not, they could not ignore the feeling that lingered in the air. Locals avoided the house, crossing the street rather than walk past it. Carriage drivers refused fares to that address. And each night, after the gas lamps were lit, a strange silence seemed to hang over number 8 Wellington Street. The inquest, the coroner's inquest, was held swiftly. Doctors testified to the brutality of the attack, noting that Eliza had suffered immensely before death. The wounds, they said, suggested a frenzy, perhaps madness. The gentleman's coat was presented as evidence. Yet the authorities stopped short of naming the man who owned it. Whispers spread through the courtroom that the coat belonged to someone untouchable, a man whose influence reached far beyond the law. In the end, no suspect was charged. No name was written in the record. The case stalled, and Londoners were left with more questions than answers. The fear that followed in the weeks after the murder. Neighbors began to report strange occurrences. One woman claimed that, as she walked past the house late one night, she heard a faint sobbing from the upper window. Another swore she saw a pale figure at the glass, standing perfectly still, staring into the street. Tenants who later moved into the building never stayed long. They described being woken by sudden drafts of icy air or by footsteps pacing the hallway outside their rooms. Some claimed to hear the sound of a woman's voice whispering in their ear as they slept, her words too faint to understand, but heavy with grief. And then there were the screams. Several witnesses reported that on certain nights, always close to the hour of her death, the silence of Wellington Street was pierced by a single, chilling scream, high, sharp, and sudden, the scream of a woman in mortal terror. When neighbours rushed into the street, there was never anyone there, only the echo of a voice that should not exist. A city haunted the story of Eliza Grimwood's murder spread far beyond Wellington Street. Londoners whispered of her fate for years. She became a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to children, a warning to young women about the dangers of wealth and power. But for those who lived closest to the scene, it was more than just a story. They believed she had never left, that her spirit lingered, searching for justice that never came. Some said her ghost would follow men who resembled her last companion. They described seeing her pale form in alleyways, vanishing just as they approached. Others swore they saw bloodstains appear and fade on the cobblestones outside the house, as though the street itself remembered her death. Even decades later, when Wellington Street was rebuilt and the house eventually demolished, strange reports continued. Pedestrians swore the temperature dropped suddenly when they passed the site. Some claimed to feel a hand brush their shoulder, though no one was there. And still, from time to time, there were reports of a scream, a single scream cutting through the night. Eliza Grimwood's murder remains unsolved. Her killer never faced justice. Her story became legend. But her ghost, they say, still walks. Eerie pause. Low strings begin to swell. We now step deeper into the theories, the suspects who might have killed Eliza, the powerful men whose names were whispered but never written down. And we explore why so many believe that even in death, she refuses to be silenced. The days after Eliza Grimwood's death were filled with dread. At first, London treated it as another scandal. The papers printed lurid details, the gossip mills churned, and gentlemen in taverns debated which of Eliza's rumoured lovers was most likely to have killed her. But soon, something else began to creep through the streets. It wasn't just fear of a murderer on the loose. It was something darker, a sense that the crime itself had poisoned the very air around Wellington Street. The dark turned for those who lived nearby. Life changed almost overnight. Families that once walked the street freely now avoided it. The windows of Eliza's home, once lit with the glow of candles, now loomed black and silent. Even in daylight, the buildings seemed to repel passers-by. The neighbours began whispering about sounds strange, faint noises that broke the silence at odd hours. Some spoke of muffled crying, as though a woman wept behind the locked shutters. Others described a sharp knock echoing through the walls, even when the house stood empty. But the most unsettling reports came from those who claimed they had glimpsed something at the windows, a pale face, eyes wide, watching, a face that vanished the moment anyone looked too closely. Strange events. It was not just the neighbours. Constables assigned to patrol Wellington Street refused the night shift. They claimed that each time they passed the house, the lamps nearest to it dimmed, flickering low until they walked beyond its shadow. One officer swore he heard footsteps following him along the pavement, matching his pace. Yet when he turned, no one was there. The coroner's men, who had removed Eliza's body from the house, also began to speak of unease. One admitted that since that morning, he had been plagued by dreams. In them, he saw Eliza reaching out, her throat open, her mouth forming words he could not hear. He awoke each night drenched in sweat, convinced she was standing at the foot of his bed. Others who had been in the room described a smell that clung to them, sharp, metallic scent of blood that returned at odd hours, no matter how many times they washed their hands. The unsettling atmosphere as weeks passed. The murder site began to take on a reputation, not just as a place of violence, but as a place of haunting. Children dared one another to run past the door at midnight. Carriage drivers cursed loudly when fares asked to be taken anywhere near Covent Garden after dark, and the neighbours began to leave offerings candles, flowers, small trinkets on the steps of the house, as if to appease whatever still lingered inside. A tavern owner across the street told patrons that he often saw the shadow of a woman pacing back and forth behind the curtains of Eliza's upstairs room. At first he assumed the house had been let again, but when he asked the landlord, he was told the property remained empty. Theories grow darker: the lack of an arrest, the silence of the authorities, and the powerful men suspected of involvement created a vacuum, one quickly filled by rumor. One theory suggested that Eliza's death was not the act of a jealous lover, but of a secret society, a ritual murder carried out to silence her after she stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. Another theory, darker still, spread through Covent Garden's back alleys, that Eliza herself had been cursed, that her dealings with men of power, her flirtations with wealth and secrecy, had drawn something unnatural into her life, something that finally claimed her in blood. Whether people believed it or not, the whispers clung to Wellington Street like fog, and each telling of the tale seemed to twist it darker. Witness accounts of the haunting: the servant who had found her body was said to have fled London entirely. Before leaving, she confided in a friend that Eliza had appeared to her twice since the murder. Once in a dream, where she sat at the foot of the servant's bed, staring silently with eyes black as coal, and once in waking life, as she walked past the house one evening. She swore she saw Eliza standing in the doorway, her dress soaked through with blood, her hand lifted as if to beckon her inside. Another chilling account came from a constable on patrol. He said that one night, as he passed number 8, he heard a woman's voice whisper his name. The sound was so clear he turned, expecting to see someone at his shoulder, but there was no one. The street was empty. He fled, refusing ever again to take that route. Even respectable citizens began reporting strange encounters. A shopkeeper claimed that on the anniversary of her death, he heard a shriek from inside the house so loud it rattled his windows. When he ran into the street, others had heard it too, yet the house remained locked and silent. The house itself, by the end of the year, Wellington Street had gained a new name among locals, the Street of the Lady in White, because those who claimed to see Eliza's spirit described her the same way, clad in white, pale as moonlight, with her throat marked in red. Tenants who dared to rent the house never lasted long. Some left after days, others after only a single night. One man, a clerk, told neighbours that he awoke to find a figure standing at the foot of his bed, its head bent at an impossible angle. When he lit his candle, the figure was gone, but his sheets were stained with spots of blood that vanished by morning. Another tenant, a widow, claimed that each night she heard footsteps ascending the stairs, stopping just outside her bedroom door. She said she would lie frozen in her bed, listening to the slow creak of the boards, and always, just before the steps ceased, she heard a whisper, "Why won't you help me?" The growing fear these stories spread feeding the terror. By the late 1820s, the murder of Eliza Grimwood was no longer just an unsolved crime, it was legend. Mothers warned their daughters never to walk alone at night. Actors in Covent Garden claimed her ghost haunted the theatre, drifting through the wings in search of her lost life. Some began to call her the White Lady of Wellington, others simply the Grimwood ghost. The fear became so intense that even skeptics avoided speaking her name after sundown. But the true horror was not just the ghost stories. It was the silence. Because the man who had killed her, whoever he was, remained free. The blood-stained coat, the suspicious cab fare, the whispers of powerful names, all of it disappeared into dust. No justice ever came. And that silence gave rise to an even more disturbing thought. If Eliza truly haunted Wellington Street, perhaps it was not only grief binding her to this world. Perhaps it was rage, building toward the horror by the time the first anniversary of her death arrived. The tension in Covent Garden was unbearable. The house remained empty, yet people swore it was not unoccupied. On May 27th, just past midnight, a crowd gathered silently across the street, watching the windows. Some claimed the curtains shifted. Others swore they saw a shadow move within. And one young boy insisted he saw her clearly, Eliza Grimwood herself, standing at the glass, her pale face pressed against it, her eyes wide and filled with terror. The boy's mother slapped him for speaking nonsense. But in the weeks that followed, others confirmed the same sight. A woman, pale, white-clad, staring out from the bedroom where the crime had occurred. A story that would not die. What made the tale so enduring was not only the brutality of the murder, but the way it refused to fade. Each retelling added a new layer of dread. Each witness account twisting the knife deeper into London's collective fear. The murder of Eliza Grimwood was no longer just a crime scene. It had become something more. A place where the boundary between the living and the dead thinned. Where time itself seemed trapped on the night of May 26th. Replaying the horror again and again. And as we step back into that night, into the silence of her bedroom, the flicker of candlelight, the soft rustle of sheets, we approached the moment that changed everything. The moment when the laughter of a young actress was cut short by the cold hand of violence. The moment when Eliza Grimwood's life ended, and her legend began. Ominous pause. Low strings rise, then cut to silence. The night of the murder is here. And in the next chapter, we confront it in all its horror. The night of May 26, 1838, began like so many others in Covent Garden. The streets were noisy with laughter spilling from the taverns, the clatter of carriages echoing against the cobblestones, and the constant hum of theatre-goers making their way to and from the play. For Eliza Grimwood, an actress of beauty and charm, it was a night she expected to end as they all did, with company, with wine, with whispered promises, but by morning, her name would be etched in blood across London's history. A woman in White Neighbours later said they saw her return home close to midnight. She was dressed in pale satin, her dark hair pinned high, her cheeks still glowing from the warmth of the stage lights and champagne. She was not alone. Witnesses saw her on the arm of a gentleman, though who he was has never been confirmed. Some swore it was a young officer. Others said a barrister of high standing. A few insisted it was a man of influence, one whose name could not safely be spoken. Whoever he was, he followed her into number 8 Wellington Street, and the door closed behind them. That was the last time Eliza Grimwood was seen alive. The room upstairs her lodgings were modest but elegant, one main sitting room on the lower floor and a bedroom above. The chamber was lit by a single candle, its flame dancing in the draught from a cracked window. On her table sat an unfinished glass of wine, a scatter of coins, and a book of poetry, open and forgotten. The neighbors, lying awake, claimed later that they heard muffled laughter, the creak of floorboards overhead, a low voice his, then hers, then silence. What happened next has never been known with certainty, but what was discovered the next morning left London reeling. The discovery at dawn, Eliza's servant entered the house. She climbed the stairs, calling softly to her mistress, expecting to find her still asleep after a late night. Instead, she found the bedroom door half open, the air heavy with a metallic scent. When she stepped inside, the sight nearly drove her mad. Eliza lay sprawled across the bed, her white gown drenched in crimson. Her throat had been cut so deep it nearly severed her head. Blood soaked the sheets, streaked the walls, pooled on the floorboards. It was everywhere. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared into nothing. Her hands were frozen mid-gesture, as though she had tried and failed to shield herself. The servant's scream brought neighbors rushing into the street. Within minutes, the house filled with horrified onlookers. Shock and panic, the Morning Chronicle reported. A young actress of Covent Garden, of some repute upon the stage, has met with a most frightful end. Her throat was cut in so barbarous a fashion as to shock even the most hardened constables. The walls and furniture bore evidence of a dreadful struggle, and it is believed the unfortunate woman must have perished in great agony. The newspaper did not mention her name outright, at first only, a lady of the theatre, but everyone in Covent Garden knew who she was. By midday, the murder of Eliza Grimwood was the only story on every lip. Witness accounts neighbors swore that in the middle of the night they had heard something strange. Not screams, but a low moaning, like the sound of someone trying and failing to call for help. One man claimed he heard hurried footsteps leaving the house around 3 in the morning. Another insisted he saw a shadow slip into a waiting cab, the driver whipping the horse hard into the mist. Yet when questioned, no one could agree on what the man looked like. Was he tall or short? Young or mid? Well-dressed or rough around the edges? It seemed every witness described a different man as, though the killer were a shifting figure, impossible to pin down. The Sun constables who entered the room later spoke of details too grisly for the press. The bedclothes were torn, the mattress sodden. A bloody handprint smeared the wall beside the bed, as though Eliza had tried to rise. Her jewelry box lay open on the dresser, untouched. Nothing was stolen, which meant this was no robbery. One officer wrote that it looked like the work of someone consumed not by greed, but by rage. Rumors of the gentleman caller attention turned immediately to the man last seen with her. He had vanished without a trace. The cab driver who had dropped them off at Wellington Street gave a curious detail. He remembered the gentleman well, but when pressed, his memory faltered. He claimed the man spoke little, kept his hat pulled low, and when he handed over the fare, his glove was already stained with something dark. The police searched for him in vain. This only fed the rumour mill. Some claimed he was a soldier. Others whispered it was a member of Parliament. One wild tale even accused the Duke of Cumberland, though this was quickly hushed. Whoever he was, he seemed to vanish into the mist that night, leaving Eliza to bleed alone. The horror spreads by noon the next day. Crowds gathered outside the house. Women clutched their children, whispering prayers. Men shook their heads, muttering about another Whitechapel horror years before Jack the Ripper would ever be known. Vendors sold crude sketches of Eliza's portrait, her beauty frozen forever, her story twisted into spectacle. The murder was no longer just a crime, it was entertainment. But for those who had seen the body, it was not entertainment. It was a vision that would never leave their dreams. The press turns dark, the newspapers seized on every rumor. Some suggested Eliza had been killed by a jealous rival actress. Others claimed it was a crime of passion by a lover whose name could not be spoken. The Times wrote, "It is a crime as senseless as it is savage. The lady met her end in a fashion more befitting the guillotine than a London bedchamber. The city will not rest until justice is found." But justice never came. Haunting details, witnesses who entered the house after the murder claimed there were details the papers dared not print. A cracked mirror, as if struck by a fist. Curtains torn from the window. A trail of bloody footprints that led partway down the stairs, and then vanished. The servant swore she saw something move in the corner of the room that morning, a shadow, darker than the others, bending low over Eliza's body. When she blinked, it was gone. Even the constables spoke of unease. One said that as he left the house, he felt a hand brush his shoulder, though the room behind him was empty. Another claimed the bloodstains on the floor seemed to pulse in the candlelight, as though refusing to fade. The aftermath of the inquest was swift but inconclusive. No suspect was ever convicted. Eliza Grimwood was laid to rest, her coffin lowered into the earth as mourners whispered prayers. But the whispers in Covent Garden never ceased. For the people of London, the horror lay not only in her violent end, but in the sense that the killer walked freely among them, that any night he might strike again. And so the story of Eliza Grimwood became more than a murder. It became a haunting. The legend begins within days of her burial. Stories began to spread. A maid passing the house at night claimed she heard a woman weeping from within. A shopkeeper swore he saw a pale face at the window, staring down into the street. The most chilling account came from a young boy, who said he saw a lady in white standing at the top of the stairs inside the house. He described her throat as red and raw, her mouth opening and closing in silence. His mother forbade him ever to speak of it again, a crime that would not fade him years later. Long after the case had grown cold, the murder of Eliza Grimwood lingered like a spectre over London. Writers compared it to the later Whitechapel horrors. Theatres whispered of her ghost wandering backstage. Watching the actresses who came after her, her story became cautionary, scandalous, supernatural all at once. But on that night, the night of May 26th, the horror was not legend. It was real. It was the sound of a blade slicing through flesh, the stifled cry of a woman who realized too late she was trapped, the silence that followed when her killer stepped out into the fog, leaving her body cooling in the dark. And for those who entered that room at dawn, the memory never left them. Closing suspense, the murder of Eliza Grimwood remains unsolved. The gentleman caller never revealed, the motive never proven. Was it a jealous lover, a man of power silenced by scandal, or something darker still, a curse that had finally claimed her? What is certain is this: her death marked Wellington Street forever. The walls of number 8 still seemed to weep with it, and those who walked past at night swore they could hear faint footsteps, the rustle of a gown, the whisper of a woman's voice asking the same question again and again: "Why did you not help me?" The morning after Eliza Grimwood's body was discovered, the fog that hung over Covent Garden felt heavier than usual. London awoke to headlines that dripped with scandal and terror. The story spread through the streets like wildfire. An actress murdered in her bed, her throat cut, her beauty destroyed in a frenzy of blood. The house on Wellington Street became the center of a macabre pilgrimage. Crowds gathered in the square, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous room, straining to overhear details from constables posted at the door. Vendors began selling cheap woodcuts of Eliza's face, her eyes large, her lips red, while whispering that she had died for her sins, in a city already suspicious of actresses, courtesans, and the blurred line between them. Eliza's death was not just a tragedy. It was a story the press would twist, and the people would consume like a kind of gruesome theatre. The police investigation, the police moved swiftly, but clumsily. The Bow Street runners, the closest thing London had to detectives, combed through the house. They found no signs of forced entry. The gentleman who had accompanied Eliza had left quietly, taking nothing with him except her life. Theories emerged almost instantly. A jealous lover. Eliza was known to keep company with men of means. Perhaps one, consumed by jealousy, had confronted her in the night. A rejected client. Some whispered that she turned men away when they could not pay. Was this a revenge killing? A man of power? Darker rumors suggested the murderer was a figure of influence, one whose name could not safely appear in print. A politician, an aristocrat. Even royalty was whispered in hushed tones. Yet for all the speculation, no one was charged. The gentleman called a most obvious suspect was the mysterious man who accompanied her home. Cabmen were questioned. One claimed to remember a tall gentleman with fair hair. Another swore the man was dark, short, and heavy-set. Their descriptions clashed so wildly that investigators could not pin down even the basics. One cab driver added a chilling detail. When the man had paid his fare, he noticed the glove he wore was stained with something dark. At the time, he thought little of it. By the next morning, he realized what it must have been, but the cabman could not give a name, and the man had vanished into the night. Theories take hold. Press wasted no time in constructing narratives. The Morning Chronicle implied Eliza's profession had invited her doom, calling her a lady of the stage, whose lifestyle may have drawn the worst kind of company. The Times, more restrained, demanded justice. Such brutality cannot be allowed to fade into obscurity. London must not sleep while the killer of Miss Grimwood walks free. The penny papers, however, revelled in the sensational. One pamphlet described Eliza's blood splashed across the walls like the crimson curtains of a theatre. Another printed lurid illustrations of a shadowed man wielding a blade. Standing over her bed, the public devoured it. And with every retelling, the story grew darker, more grotesque. Contradictions and dead-end witnesses were unreliable. One claimed to have seen Eliza alive after midnight, walking alone, no gentleman in sight. Another insisted she returned home with 2 men. Not one. Some said her death was too savage to be the work of a stranger, had to be personal. Others believed no ordinary man could have done it, that the crime carried the mark of madness. Every contradiction deepened the mystery, and every dead end made London shiver. If the killer could not be found, then perhaps he would strike again. A suspect emerges for a brief moment. Suspicion fell on a man named Ware, a gambler known in London's darker circles. He had been associated with Eliza, and his reputation was foul. But the evidence against him was thin, little more than rumour. Others whispered of a wealthy patron who frequented the theatres, a man who had been seen slipping coin into Eliza's hand. But when constables inquired, witnesses fell silent. Some claimed fear. Others claimed memory failed them. It was as though a veil had fallen over the truth, the curse of the stage. As the weeks dragged on with no arrests, the story began to transform. Eliza was no longer merely a victim of murder. She became an omen. Theatres whispered of her ghost wandering backstage, trailing a scent of iron and candle smoke. Actresses reported seeing a pale figure in the wings, watching them perform. Stagehands swore they heard sobbing in empty dressing rooms. Her name was invoked in gossip columns as a warning of the dangers of vanity, of ambition, of female independence. A convenient moral shaped to suit the public appetite. But behind the whispers, the fact remained. Her killer was still out there, a city obsessed for months. The house on Wellington Street stood as a symbol of dread. Passers-by crossed the street rather than walk too close. Children dared each other to touch its front steps. Inside, bloodstains refused to fade, no matter how many times the floorboards were scrubbed. Servants refused to stay, claiming they heard footsteps at night, and once, a low voice whispering in the dark. Neighbors swore that on quiet evenings, the sound of weeping carried through the walls. Contradictions, multiply some reports, insisted. Eliza had been seen alive the next morning, walking hurriedly across Covent Garden. But this was impossible. Her body was already cooling. Upstairs, another rumor suggested the murder weapon was discovered in the Thames. A blood-stained razor fished from the water days later. Yet when questioned, police denied it. The contradictions were endless. Every new detail contradicted another. Every lead dissolved into rumor. Theories darkened with no answers. The theories grew darker still. Some whispered of secret societies, their members bound by blood oath never to reveal the killer's name. Others suggested it was the work of a man already infamous, a traveling murderer leaving bodies across Europe, never staying long enough to be caught. And then there were the supernatural whispers that Eliza had been cursed, that her death was the price for fame and beauty in a city that loved its actresses but despised them too. A crime without justice, the inquest concluded with frustration. Eliza Grimwood had been murdered by person or persons unknown. And so the case was closed, unsolved. But the city did not forget. Her name lingered in tavern songs, in stage whispers, in penny dreadfuls sold at the markets. She became a ghost story, a warning, a mystery carved into the heart of London, and in the shadows of Wellington Street. It is said her presence never left. Closing suspense the aftermath of Eliza. Grimwood's murder left a city trembling with unanswered questions. Who was the gentleman caller? Why did the witnesses contradict each other so completely? And why, with so much public outrage, did the investigation falter so quickly? Perhaps the answers were buried long ago, hidden to protect a powerful man. Or perhaps the truth was simply too strange, too horrifying, to be believed. What remains is the silence of that bedroom, the blood on the walls, and the legend of a young actress who walked home one night and never walked out again. By the time months had passed, Eliza Grimwood's murder had become more than a crime. It had become a curse. London, hungry for answers and unsatisfied by the fumbling of its constables, began to invent its own. Whispers moved from tavern to theatre, from broadsheet to back alley, until fact and folklore were indistinguishable. The name Grimwood no longer belonged only to a murdered woman. It belonged to a legend. The house that would not rest, number 8 Wellington Street, became a place people avoided. Its windows were dark, its walls heavy with silence. Tenants who tried to live there never lasted long. One maid insisted she heard Eliza's footsteps pacing upstairs each night at the exact same hour she was killed. Another claimed to see crimson seeping through the floorboards, staining her mop, though no blood was there. By the 1840s, the house had already earned a reputation as cursed ground. Even when new tenants painted the walls, repaired the floors, and tried to restore its reputation, neighbors swore they could hear faint cries drifting from the windows whenever the night was still. The ghost in white there. Most common tale was that of the lady in white, cabmen waiting for fares in Covent. Gardens swore they sometimes saw a pale figure glide along Wellington Street, her gown flowing behind her, her face hidden in shadow. She would appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly. Horses balked, refusing to move forward. One driver even swore that the woman entered his cab only for him to look back and find the seat empty. Others said she stood at the upstairs window, gazing down at the street with lifeless eyes. Those brave enough to pass beneath her claimed a chill would fall over them, their breath frosting even on warm nights. Theatre whispers in. The theatres where Eliza once performed. Her ghost became part of the backstage lore. Actresses claimed they saw her in their mirrors, standing just behind them, her throat a gaping wound. Stagehands heard soft weeping in the dressing rooms long after everyone had gone. One performer swore that during a rehearsal, she felt a hand touch her shoulder and when she turned. No one was there. Whether these were tricks of the mind or something darker, no one could say. But for those who believed, Eliza had not left the stage. She lingered, trapped between applause and silence, a player whose final act had been stolen from her. Folklore overtakes fact with time. The story changed. Some said Eliza had been killed not by a man at all, but by a demon she had unknowingly invited into her home. Others insisted she had been cursed by a jealous rival, her death foretold in dreams. One tale even claimed she was the first victim of a figure who would later stalk, Whitechapeler shadow of what would one day be called Jack the Ripper. The truth was buried beneath layers of invention. The brutality of her death demanded explanation, and when the courts could not provide it, the city turned to myth. The cursed name there is something about the name Grimwood that seemed to feed the imagination. Newspapers of the time often described it as a name befitting a tragedy. It sounded funereal, ominous, as though destiny itself had marked her soon. Children told stories of the Grimwood curse, warning that to speak her name aloud at midnight was to invite her spirit into your home. In taverns, drunks claimed to have seen her blood-stained figure standing at the foot of their beds. Whether born of guilt, fascination, or fear, the idea of a curse clung to her memory like a shroud. Fact versus folklore, and yet, when one strips away the stories, the facts remain cold and few. Eliza Grimwood was a young actress. She returned home with a gentleman on the night of May 26, 1827. She was found the next morning with her throat savagely cut. The man was never identified. No conviction was ever made. Everything else, the footsteps, the ghost in white, the curse's embellishment. But that is the strange power of unsolved crimes. The lack of resolution creates fertile ground for fear. Without answers, the imagination fills the gaps. The living haunting, some historians argue that the true haunting was not Eliza's ghost, but the way her story lingered in the collective mind of London. Her death became a warning for women of the stage, a tale to remind them of their fragility in a city that desired them but also despised them. Others suggest the haunting was the guilt of the city itself. That Covent Garden, with its drunken revelry and shadowed alleys, had demanded a sacrifice. Eliza simply became the victim who paid that price. Still, the accounts of strange phenomena cannot be dismissed entirely. Too many witnesses spoke of too many oddities: cries in the night, blood that would not fade, a woman seen long after she had been laid to rest, the shadow of Whitechapel decades later. When Jack the Ripper terrorized Whitechapel, some Londoners drew a chilling connection. They said the Grimwood case had been a precursor rehearsal for horrors yet to come. Both targeted women, tied to the stage or the sex trade. Both involved a savagery that seemed almost inhuman. Both left the city trembling, with no answers, only shadows. Was it coincidence? Or was Eliza the first in a line of victims stretching across time, claimed by something darker than any man? The mystery that lingers today, nearly 2 centuries later, the murder of Eliza Grimwood, remains unsolved. Her name has faded from the front pages, yet in the quiet corners of London, her story is still told. Guides point to Wellington Street, their voices dropping low, their eyes scanning the windows. Locals swear the air there feels colder, heavier. As if weighed down by memory, the line between fact and folklore has blurred beyond recognition. Did a gentleman of influence truly kill her and escape justice? Or was it, as the whispers insist, a curse of darkness that claimed her and never let go? No one knows, and perhaps no one ever will. Closing suspense, what we do know is this. On the night of May 26, 1827, Eliza Grimwood's laughter filled her small house in Covent Garden. Hours later, her blood stained its walls. The man who left that house vanished forever, his name swallowed by silence. And in the absence of truth, a legend was born. Some say her ghost still waits there, standing in the window, staring into the fog. Others claim she follows those who dare to speak her name aloud, her shadow slipping silently into their homes. What is certain is that Eliza's story has never ended. It lingers in the stones of Wellington Street, in the whispers of the theatres, in the shiver that runs down your spine when you walk alone at night, because in London there are crimes that remain forever unsolved, and there are ghosts that never rest. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the night Eliza Grimwood's life was stolen in her small Covent Garden home. Time has changed London, its streets, its buildings, even its people, but some shadows refuse to fade. Her name, whispered long enough, still carries weight. A house that refused to survive, the house at number 8 Wellington Street, no longer stands. Like many buildings of that era, it was eventually torn down, swallowed by London's endless hunger for progress. And yet, even without the physical walls, locals insist that the place remains tainted. Ghost tours that pass near its old location slow their pace. Guides lower their voices, pointing to the cobblestones where the house once stood. They speak of sudden chills in the air, the feeling of being watched, the sense that the ground itself remembers. Some swear that even after the building's demolition, cries and footsteps were heard at night, as if the house itself refused to let go of its final, violent act. The legend in print and on screen, the story of Eliza Grimwood, has never been fully forgotten. Historians, criminologists, and writers have returned to it again and again, searching for meaning in its silence. Books on unsolved Victorian crimes often devote chapters to her, painting her as a tragic figure whose death foreshadowed the horrors of Jack the Ripper decades later. Television documentaries on haunted London often place her alongside the most chilling of ghost stories, her lady-in-white figure lingering in the frame. Paranormal investigators still claim that the site carries a heavy energy, a residue of suffering that cannot be explained away. In each retelling, she becomes something more than a victim. She becomes a symbol of mystery, of injustice, of the way the past refuses to release its grip on the present, the ghost that will not leave today. Eliza Grimwood is often listed among London's most famous ghosts. Her name is invoked alongside the screaming spectre of Anne Boleyn and the shadowy monks of the Tower of London. The Lady in White is still said to drift through Covent Garden, her form pale against the glow of street lamps. Some cab drivers still share stories of picking up a passenger who vanishes mid, leaving only the faint smell of perfume and the echo of weeping. Whether these accounts are imagination, folklore, or something darker, they persist. And with each retelling, her presence grows stronger. The cold weight of memory, perhaps the most unsettling truth, is this: we do not remember Eliza because of who she was. History has not preserved her laughter, her ambitions, or her voice. What remains is her end, the violent mystery of it, the unanswered questions. She lingers not as a woman, but as a wound, a scar etched into the city itself. And maybe that is the cruelest fate of all, to be remembered not for living, but for haunting. A story that still breathes. Walk Wellington Street at night, and you may notice it. The air feels heavier. The silence between footsteps grows louder. The shadows seem deeper. And if you truly listen, you might hear something faint. A whisper, a sigh, the sound of someone who has been waiting far too long, because Eliza Grimwood's story was never given an ending. Her killer was never found. Justice never came. And so her tale, like her ghost, continues to walk beside us, even now. Nearly 200 years have slipped away since Eliza Grimwood's body was discovered in that small house on Wellington Street. And yet, the memory of her murder still clings to London like a fog that refuses to lift. The newspapers of the time screamed her name. Investigators scoured every clue, and countless men were accused and dismissed. But in the end, no justice was ever found. No confession, no trial, no closure. All that remains is the brutality of the act and the silence that followed. Eliza was not a queen, not a noblewoman, not even someone history would have noticed had her life ended in old age. She was an actress, a daughter, a young woman trying to survive in a city that devoured the poor and forgotten. And yet, in death, she became something else entirely. Her name lingers in archives, in whispers, and in shadows. She is not remembered for the roles she played on stage, but for the role forced upon her that night, the eternal victim, trapped between fact and folklore. Some say her ghost roams Covent Garden, searching for the face of her killer. Others believe her spirit is bound not to the street, but to the memory itself, doomed to wander wherever her story is told. Perhaps that's why, nearly 2 centuries later, we still speak her name. Perhaps in telling her story, we invite her presence. And yet, the question remains: what truly happened on that night in 1827? Was it a lover's betrayal, a crime of passion? Was it the shadow of a wealthy patron silencing a scandal before it began? Or was it something far darker, something that walked into that house with Eliza Grimwood and never truly left? We will never know. But one thing is certain: the The story of Eliza Grimwood does not rest quietly in its grave. It lingers, it waits, and if you ever find yourself on Wellington Street, alone, in the hours just before dawn, you may feel it too, the weight of eyes upon you, the sound of weeping carried on the wind, and perhaps, just perhaps, the soft touch of a hand that has been reaching through the centuries, searching for the justice it was denied. The past never dies. Sometimes, it doesn't even sleep.